Welcome to the webinar on what is happening in the Sydney accounting employment market. My name's Geoff Balmer, one of the co-founders of Lloyd Recruitment. What are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to cover off a wide range of subjects to try and help be informative to you so that you know what's happening out there in the accounting employment market here in Sydney. Let's start off. We'll run through the current situation of what we are seeing. We're going to talk about the trends we're currently seeing, which all affect hybrid working. We'll run through the remuneration side. Are we being shown the money? We'll talk about the skill sets that are most in demand, how to hire people and what hiring strategy should you use. And we're going to run through the future market insights and finish on AI, which we hear about every single day. So the context to this webinar is based on data which we've generated this year. And we've generated the data from the 680 roles that we have worked across metropolitan Sydney here in 2025. We as a business work with a range of organisations, and you can see here on the map, there's organisations all over metropolitan Sydney. And the roles we work with companies of all shapes and sizes, some multinationals, some in different industries. The candidate information is generated from the 3,974 interviews that we have conducted this year, and we'll share that information with you, which hopefully you'll find of use. So what is the current situation? Well, let's start off by running through what we're seeing around job vacancies. Now, this is job vacancies across the whole Australian economy, not just around accounting. What we can see is that vacancies are holding up pretty well and are definitely a lot better than they were in the sort of pre-pandemic. So it's pretty encouraging on the whole. What we can see is there's been a very slight drop recently in sort of September this year. However, we found October has actually been a pretty good month. One thing to note, though, is that it's very industry specific. Some industries are facing particular own challenges, and that's dictating what sort of hiring patterns are happening in those. As a business in recruitment who's been around since 2008, we found it very hard to predict what is actually happening right now. And sometimes when we think it's going to be quiet, we are busy. For example, last year, December was probably the month where we saw the highest volume of permanent roles come through, which is quite interesting. The one thing which is worth considering is that we do know that the pandemic has marked a big structural shift in how labour is here in Australia. The labour market hasn't really adjusted back to pre-pandemic levels. And right now, there is some reluctance for workers to change jobs based on their own circumstances. And our gut feel is that people aren't as inclined to be climbing up the corporate ladder. They're more interested in finding a role which fits in with their own personal circumstances. So we often call it job mover anxiety, but it's definitely out there. If we look at the Australian unemployment rates, now again, we can see that the unemployment rate has edged up slightly higher in September 2025. However, it's still quite a bit lower than it has been in previous years. And October has bounced up a little bit, but on the whole, unemployment is pretty low. The challenge, obviously, for Australia is that we have tricky inflation, which is causing a few economic headaches for the Reserve Bank. With interest rates, this is really taking a bit of a toll on consumer confidence. Bigger picture, though, globally, yes, there are some issues around the trade tariffs are obviously a big one for a lot of sectors. Quite a few Western economies have quite a high debt issue. There's high inflation overseas. And obviously there is some geopolitical conflicts, which makes it a disruptive time economically. However, all things considered, economically, Australia is doing pretty well compared to other Western economies. So how do we feel as consumers? Because whilst there's some good news there, as consumers, I don't feel we really feel it. And if we do some research, and if we look at the Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Sentiment Index, this fell down to 3.5% in October. However, earlier in the year, consumer confidence was up in April and May, and then has fallen back again in the last 2 months. So consumer sentiment is still higher than it was than when we had the cost of living crisis maybe 12 months ago. But interestingly, when we look at other measures, is that views on family finances have definitely weakened a little bit. And certainly the assessment of the broader economic outlook is pretty mixed. 12-month outlook has slipped a smidge, but the long-term outlook is actually very, very positive. So it's an interesting time that we find ourselves in. The time to buy a major household item index has definitely slipped a little bit. But, from the last couple of slides, unemployment's low, good volume of job vacancies. Generally, Australia is in good shape, as long as we don't mention about the cost of buying a house. So what about the number of people who are out there looking for roles? Well, on the left-hand side here, we can see that shows the overall volume of Seek job ads in Australia, and we can see a steady decline after the peak of the pandemic. On the right-hand side, you can see the number of average Seek applications per job advert across Australia, and this has been rising quite quickly. Now, it's been rising not because we've suddenly had a mass influx of a huge amount of people. It's rising partly because the algorithms have changed, and they've changed to actually make it easier to apply. So we now know from our research that over 50% of candidates spend on average 23 seconds reading the job ad and then applying. And when I catch the bus home and I stand up and I look down and see everybody on their phones, I'm sure there's people there who have had a bad day in the office and think, you know what, it's time to find a new job. Click, 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 and off we go. The consequence of this is obviously it is causing a lot of headaches for people in the job hunting process, and obviously for HR, talent teams and recruiters like us alike. It's very hard to get back to all the applicants because we're bombarded by the job volume. And we're actually seeing as a business more companies who are being swamped by the volume of candidates call us as they don't really know where to start. So they're reaching out to us to say, listen, you gave us a shortlist quickly last time. We need one quickly this time because we don't have time to go through the pure volume of candidates. And one of the interesting things here is whilst we look at the volume of applicants and say, wow, well, it's over 200 for a job. The interesting part of this is that pre-pandemic, we would probably get about 50 applications per position, and we would interview 10 of those. Now we get over 200, but we're still only interviewing 10. And when we've done a bit of a deep dive, what we realize is that there's a lot of people from interstate, a lot of people from overseas, and the job market has become quite specific. So people are being more knocked out. But, I don't certainly think there's suddenly the number of quality applicants has suddenly increased overnight. If we look at Seek job ads by state, now the good news here is if you're in New South Wales, go the Mighty Blues. You're living in the best state economy. New South Wales is doing pretty good. And again, job volumes are, still well above pre-pandemic levels, slightly lower than the high of 2023. So we know that in New South Wales, the fight for talent is very, very high. The consequence, though, is, the high volume of Seek applicants is that we are probably using a greater range of search tools because there's more Seek applicants, there's more Seek jobs. So from when we are looking to put together a shortlist, we're using our database where we have over 100,000 people. And we're probably looking to use other tools to find people quickly to try and put together that bespoke shortlist. So what are accountants looking for in their next role? What is most important? Well, out of the 3,974 accountants that we interviewed, what was most important to them was really progression. It's not higher salary, which is at the top. It's 48% of people want progression. So if you're hiring someone, you need to lay out the journey of where this position is going to take them. Company culture is second at 15%. Stability is 13%. Work-life balance is 11%. Locations 9%. But down the bottom, higher salary. So it's quite interesting. Here we are in a cost of living crisis, and we have been for a while now. However, money's not the motivator. People want to learn and grow. So it's really important when you're looking to hire people next. Before this webinar, we were asked by quite a few companies to explain and to look into the offshore versus onshoring process. And we would estimate that probably at least 50% of companies here in Sydney have some form of offshoring in their accounting or finance teams. How successful is it? Well, we hear some very mixed results. For some companies, it's a great success. For others, though, it is a bit more challenging depending on how they're setting it up. The one thing which is worth bearing in mind is that certainly offshore contractors are now considered permanent employees. And there's a recent court case which has had a big effect on this. So you do need to bear this in mind if you're looking to set up an offshore operation. The other part is that we see probably now more companies looking to automate processes than send them offshore because they want to keep the knowledge in-house. The principal reason offshoring is generally cost savings. And if you are going to do it, you've just got to think of the long term. You will experience a whole range of new issues if you offshore. Recently I was talking to someone who had an offshore operation in a rather unstable country. And so they were getting asked most every fortnight for a pay rise. Now, that's quite interesting, right? The one thing which I would say is if you're going to do it, you need to do it for a long-term basis because we see quite a few companies of all sizes, offshore, then onshore, then offshore, then onshore. You lose your IP. And again, I don't think it's going to be overly successful for your organization. The one consequence, which, it is a bit of an elephant in the room, but it is worthwhile discussing, is what are the consequences to graduates? With many junior transaction roles, which were often a pathway for many finance professionals to come through, this has meant that the consequence is there's been a lot less opportunities for graduates. And what we'll start to see is a lot less opportunities. Well, we'll struggle to find those people in 2 to 3 years' time as the graduate numbers really drop. So it's a challenge which, as an industry, we need to tackle. And maybe it's a question that the education side of accounting needs to change. We need to understand and explore what different pathways can we use to get people into the profession, because otherwise in 20, 30 years' time, there'll be a lot less CFOs to be choosing from right now. So let's look at working arrangements. And, if we go back to March 2020, when COVID first started, working arrangements obviously were forced to change back then. And obviously for a lot of people, we've never looked back. A lot of people have found newfound freedom and are really enjoying their newfound working arrangements. So we've done a study of the last 200 organizations that we've recruited permanent roles for, and we've looked at the working arrangements. So up to almost a third, so 32.5% are asking for people to be in the office 5 days a week. And bear in mind, last year when we run through this exercise, it was 25%. 18% are asking people to do 4 days a week. This is pretty similar to last year. 46.5%, it's 3 days a week. This is very similar to last year. So the real change has been less remote and 2 days and a slight increase in the 5 days a week. Now, I went away and asked the team at Richard Lloyd what did they think people were doing when we met them as candidates. And their view was they thought about a fifth was doing 5 days a week in the office. 23% were doing 4 days, 41% was doing 3 days. So the most popular option is definitely the 3 days a week in the office for many people. So how do accountants prefer to work? Well, interesting question. We conducted a poll recently, and this is how people like to work. In 2025, 14% want to work fully remotely anywhere in the country. 53% want to do only 1 to 2 days in the office, which I don't think is much. 29% want to do 3 to 4 days in the office, and 4% want to do 5 days. So the message is very clear. Accountants like a hybrid working arrangement. And if you want to attract the best talent, if your organization is dictating 5 days, that will impact the talent pool you can choose from. And on this subject, we do find that there's quite a few candidates who will ring up and say, listen, we have the dream job for you, the job and the company that you've told us you want to work for. But often the question we get hit with first is, what are the working arrangements? So we asked another poll, have you been asked to change your working from home setup? And here, 16% have been asked and are okay with it. 20% have been asked and aren't happy about it. 24% haven't been asked and they want to work from home a little bit more. And 39% haven't been asked and are happy. So it's some interesting feedback that we're receiving about what's actually happening out there with the working from home trends. So we do know in the future there's a fair bit of a challenge. Working from home, in my view, is definitely here to stay. But as organisations, we need to understand how do we meet the challenge of working from home. And one of the big things is how do we get fresh ideas? I'm not sure if many people have heard of the expression job huggers. Job hugging is where an employee stays in a role even though they're unhappy or find the role unfulfilling. I heard a stat a while ago which said only 13% of people who work in Australia feel engaged in what they do, which is startlingly low. So we need to find ways to look to see how do we keep staff more engaged, especially those who are working remotely or we're not seeing that much of. How do we keep developing and training these staff? How do we keep making our workplaces collaborative? We need to find some solutions. And interestingly, with the fully remote, let me tell you a story. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who runs an IT consulting business. They're fully remote, no office presence. And they asked me if one of their sales staff could come and spend a day in our office here in Sydney, because they had never worked in a proper sales environment and they didn't really understand how how it worked from a cultural perspective. So it's interesting the problems that people are facing with the new working from home arrangements, and who knows, some new industries may set up which offer simulated workplaces. Who knows? So remuneration, what is happening on the remuneration side? Show me the money, as we like to say. Now, we're going to run through what we're seeing from a remuneration point of view, but it is worthwhile putting out here a rather large disclaimer because we do see even greater variation on salaries, especially at the executive side. What industry you're in does have an impact on your salary, the size of the business, the complexity, all of those factors all play a part. So we've taken the average from the last 680 roles that we've worked across a whole range of different accounting positions. So the average salary increase that we've seen across roles in Sydney has been 4.9%. And if we look at the base salaries for support workers, which is really more that transactional side, we can see here that accounts payable has stayed pretty similar, hasn't moved too much, although they still remain very hard roles to fill. AR officers are up around 9%. Billings is up 9%. And again, is very much a specialized skill set, which is probably facing a declining workforce because people aren't really going into billings anymore. Billing managers have definitely gone up, but we've definitely seen more roles for billing managers who have some transformation skills, especially in the professional services sectors. Payroll managers are up 14%. And again, not many people are actually entering payroll as a profession, so it is a declining skill set. And the one thing which does surprise me here is payroll officers. That hasn't moved up that much, which I find surprising. Again, it is a declining profession. We don't see many young people go into payroll as a profession. However, when we have a job, it is very hard to find good quality candidates, partly because they often do tend to stay in roles. And also as well, a lot of the roles that we get often are payroll officers with a particular system, which does limit the talent pools quite a bit. If we look at the part qualified average base salaries, well, assistant accountants haven't really changed, which again, I find quite interesting because again, we have got a real reduction in graduates coming through. Maybe the volume of roles has changed because more have been offshored, hard to say. Bookkeepers, which obviously, are more roles onshore, which again, supporting small companies. This has gone up again by about 9%. Again, a little bit of a declining skill set, and we don't see many people who go into entry-level bookkeepers. The one point which is worth mentioning on the assistant accountant side is that a lot of candidates in this space are often on visas. So it does make it quite difficult to actually find, a local or someone who's on a citizen or a permanent resident in this field, because most people are on a graduate student visa of some sort. If we look at the mid-level salaries, so those middle-level accounting roles like the accountant analyst type of roles, we can see here that BAs haven't really gone up too much, which does surprise me because we've had a fair few roles, especially around that sort of transformation type of work. I haven't included systems accountant roles in the BA side. It's more, I suppose, more of a traditional finance BA. Financial accountants have gone down a smidge. They obviously shot up a lot in the pandemic. They were up to about 130k plus super during 2023. Management accountants have crept up about 7%. And certainly we find more and more of these roles are asking for BI experience, especially Power BI, which seems a very popular tool to be used. Finance business partners have gone up 7%. And this is a role where, again, you can see a big salary differential. Again, some finance business partners will be earning 160, 170, depending on the industry that you're in. Some of them are in not-for-profit, which obviously would have the salary packaging figure of about 12 to 15 on top of this. So bit of a range. And if we move on to the leadership roles, so the management-based salaries. So again, we can see here that we've got the average CFO sitting at 266. Now, some of those CFO roles we've had around the early 200s could potentially be called FC roles. So this does sway the data a little bit, especially because we've had quite a few roles paying over 300k. I haven't included incentives. And interestingly, we have seen a few roles recently which have actually had an equity play in it as well, which we haven't seen for a while. Commercial manager roles haven't moved that much. And again, often we don't see that many come onto the market externally. They tend to be obviously a lot of source from internally because they're quite desirable roles for finance folks. Finance manager roles are up 8% to 154k. Finance controller roles are up 11% to 189k. And we've seen a pretty steady volume of these two positions. FP&A manager roles are up to about 193k, obviously found in larger organisations, and you do tend to find people do tend to stay in these roles a little bit longer. So again, quite interesting figures, but you do see big variables on these roles based on the industry and the size of the organisation. If we look at the temp side, which again is quite an interesting factor really to bear in mind, our temp team place over about 200 roles every year, and the hourly rates give us a good glimpse into the cost of available talent at the moment. Bear in mind that historically you would often receive a 25% casual loading on your hourly rate. So we can see here, AP clerks have gone up by 18% in the last 12 months to $46 an hour plus super. Now, again, this is probably equating to about 82, so not a massive casual loading there to compensate for that lack of annual leave and stuff. Assistant accountants are up by 9%. Financial accountants haven't really gone anywhere. Now, when I've done my research here, the reason for this is we often feel that we have all of the newly qualified CA first-time movers from the Big Four over here in Sydney. We're convinced there's no one left in Dublin or the UK at the moment. So it has meant with a lot of supply, it's meant that rates have stayed pretty low. Management accountants are about 13% more than what they earned a year ago, and payroll officers are up 12%. And again, the temp team will tell me that to find a payroll officer, especially for a short-term assignment, is very slim pickings. Long-term, not so bad. Perm, not so bad, but short-term, rather challenging, to be honest with you. So let's look at the skill sets that are most in demand. Well, for CFOs and senior finance folk, it is really about leadership. Few CFOs, FCs tell us they actually receive proper leadership development and training. We know this is detrimental to the organisation as many CFOs become great CEOs. So if you are a finance leader, I would really be pushing to get some some external training to give you some new ideas. In a recent University of Sydney Skills Horizon report, they describe the next decade as the messy decade, which is full of ambient uncertainty. And they highlight a couple of issues for leaders. One is, how do you handle the different generations? And you'll be working with multiple generations. And we do know that different generations have very different ideas around working arrangements, different motivations. They have different timeframes for progression as well. So a fair few challenges there. They do describe that leaders actually need to really work on their stability and calmness. There's a lot of external noise going on all around us. So it's a question of, how can you be a strong mentor? How can you be a really good developer of people? And do you need to find some quite creative ways of working with the multiple generations? Do you need to educate people through TikTok videos? Do you need to do performance reviews on Snapchat? I mean, who knows? It's quite baffling to think about this, but it is a factor that leaders need to bear in mind. If we look at the more mid-level, so what other skills do we need as a more mid-level accountant? Well, there's definitely a lot of demand for accountants who have very strong analytical thinking, someone who can really see beyond the numbers they're looking at. someone who has the confidence to question and challenge people. And again, bring the numbers to life with the non-finance people. It's really about being that confident finance professional who can really challenge, tell a story, and can really have a quite a flexible approach to how they work and how they make different people understand the major issues that the organization needs to address. If we look at the tech side, which let's face it is such a big factor to all our working ways these days. Obviously, finance professionals that are across AI is very much in demand, and the demand will only get greater. Again, how can you do more with less? How you go about understanding and utilize big data is very, very important. A number of years ago, I did a presentation and it was a while ago because Tableau was really big at the time. And someone in the audience put their hand up and said, well, where can I buy this big data from? Now, obviously, you can't go and buy it. It's on your databases. But again, the ability to use that and get the best results from it is really important to organizations. ERPs, we go and see many companies, and one of the big frustrations and pain points is their ERP isn't working well enough, or that their ERP is 20 years old, and they can't quite face spending all the amount of thousands of dollars on getting a new one in. BI tools, obviously BI tools have been around for a long time, but obviously they've come down a lot in price. And so, you need to be BI efficient for all roles really to be across the sort of dashboards and information you can report as finance professionals. And the big thing is just keep on learning technology. It's such a big part of our roles. You can't be afraid of it. You really need to embrace it, learn it, and grow with it. Now, one of the big things coming up, of course, for finance people, which will be a skill that's in demand, is ESG. Now, I won't profess to be an ESG expert. However, I do know it stands for environmental, social, and governance. And I do know that it's already here. So if you are, working for a large corporate, from the 1st of January this year, you need to start your ESG reporting. For mid-sized companies, it's relevant from 1st of July 2026. And from smaller companies with revenues of $50 million or more, it's relevant from the 1st of July 2027. So if you want to avoid paying large consultancy fees to those big firms, there's 4 of them, then I suggest you get across this now because, it's here to stay and it will be a challenge for the future. Let's discuss, how do we hire the best talent? What are the strategies that you need to use to be able to find the best talent for your business? This is the process that we would recommend. Number 1, it's about putting together a really good job spec. In all the noise of the last few years, we found that a lot of companies, they're trying to try all sorts of different processes. And sometimes they're getting some mixed bag results. So we would suggest put together a proper job spec and send it to the candidate. Virtually every candidate asks us for a copy of this. So put something together which articulates clearly what the job is and what's involved. The next part then is to understand exactly what are the skills you need to hire and understand who's going to interview them and how you're going to interview them. And this is something that we can help you with. So you want to interview against the skills and the competencies that they have, as opposed to just trying to find someone from a similar industry who's done a similar role, because that person will probably get bored in a few months' time. And there was a Harvard study which basically assessed the performance of candidates who joined organizations who had industry experience relevant to the organization and people who didn't. And they found that in the first 6 months, those people with industry experience, yes, they performed a lot better. But after the first 6 months, it was the people with non-industry experience which really performed a lot better and were going to be the future leaders of the organizations. So again, think about the competencies, think about the skills you need to interview, find some questions, and then work together a pretty comprehensive process. And on the subject of process, it's really good that you have a seamless process because, people are going to go home, their partners, their family, their friends are going to say, oh, how did you go in that job interview? And if there's a slow pause between rounds or no feedback, people lose interest, or their partners, family, friends at home say, I wouldn't bother with them. They don't seem to have their act together. So, making sure you give a good outward impression is really, really important. And that brings us on to really putting together the employee value proposition. It is competitive out there. So how do you make sure that you are getting the information that you need to out about your organization? You need to be explaining the culture. Then you need to talk through the fun things you do. You need to talk through the leadership style. And also, we know that candidates are attracted by the progression opportunities. So talk about the journey. Don't be afraid to say negative, but talk about where, if this person joins, what are they going to envisage and where they're going to end up longer term. And on the subject of longer term, we really need to plan for the future. There's a really good article by one of the partners at Egon Zehnder, which talks about the fact that we all hire people like we have done in the last 10 to 20 years. And we really actually need to be hiring for 2 to 3 years' time. So it's a question of hiring for tomorrow, not just for today. And we need to, identify the skills we need in our organization, but then we need to really interview against those skills. And that's going to make us a lot more robust for the future. So the future market insights, what's actually happening out there? Well, I wish I had a crystal ball, but let me share with you what I think we're going to see. Globally, I've done some research here, and the World Economic Forum, basically, which is an organization which has interviewed 1,000 top global employers, predicts a net increase of 70 million jobs by 2030. And there's going to be new roles in all sorts of industries, from technology, the green transition, agriculture, construction, sales, AI, healthcare, education, all sorts. Now, there's no doubt there will be a decline in the clerical and the secretarial. But remember, in all these new roles, someone still needs to do the numbers, and those people are you. So it's really important to remember that, it's not the doom and gloom about, well, we're not going to need anybody. It's all going to be robots. I don't really buy into that story. Interestingly, when we look at some of the companies we work with, we've recently been doing some work with companies who, A, I'd never heard of, but B, I'd never even heard of the products that they actually did. Now, I've been recruiting since 98 here in Sydney, and it's quite baffling, some of the industries that we're finding are cropping up. And, I was talking to a builder the other day, and he was telling me he was in his 50s. He was a little bit over the physical side of building, and he was about to go and sit his his license to be a drone pilot. Now, that job wasn't around 10 years ago. So it's quite interesting to see the new professions that are springing up. And remember, someone still needs to do the numbers for all these professions. So where will the new jobs be, and what will the makeup be? Well, there's no doubt cyber is going to be there. And on the left, I've got my blue circle to signify cyber. Accountants who understand the importance of cyber and protecting data and are across cyber will definitely be in demand. The middle is ESG, and definitely ESG is coming, and you need to be across the reporting side of it. And finally, those finance professionals who can stand up, bring the numbers to life, make sure they're at the heart of all the decision making that goes on in an organization, and can motivate teams, those CFOs will always be in demand despite the future. So let's move on and talk about AI, okay? Because we hear about it every day, and there's no doubt whilst again, it's affecting accounting, it's affecting recruitment, the whole job process. So AI in the job process, we know from our research that I think Seek has said that over 50% of resumes now are expected to be created with the support of AI. And interestingly, let me share some stories. There was someone recently who went for a job, and the AI tool the company was using knocked back the resume because it detected AI in the resume. So AI was anti-AI. There was another situation I heard of where a candidate of mine who was an excellent candidate, she applied for a role with a large Australian bank, and they clearly read the resume because in 0.5 seconds, she got knocked back. Interestingly, when she, we passed, and then she got a phone call from a friend who worked at the bank, and they referred her to the job, and she got the job. So we do know companies are using AI tools in the process, and it will have an impact on how we go about doing things. And also the process has changed a little bit as well. If someone said to me, do I write a cover letter? I often say, listen, I would make it short because I don't believe they read that much. But again, I know someone recently who went for a senior manager position, and the most important thing in the process for the company was what was in the cover letter. So interesting stuff, huh? If we look at, companies who are actually using AI and what they're actually doing with it. So again, there's been some really good reports being produced. And there's one from the MIT Media Lab. And they basically put out a report saying that despite $30 to $40 billion in enterprise spending on Gen AI, 95% haven't seen a return yet. Okay. And there's another one which was titled The Gen AI Divide, State of AI in Business. Just 5% of integrated AI pilots are proving to be worth a lot of money. So, it's worth trying to understand what you're trying to fix. It's not the be all and end all. It's been here for quite a while now. It's only, again, we're going to use it more and more, but, it's just about how you encompass and make sure it works for your organization. And let me share with you some examples of what we're hearing about. Number one is that we know a company here in Sydney who, again, they've replaced some of their credit controllers with I'm not sure what you call it, but it would be an AI person who does the credit control calls. And they were finding it hard to recruit credit controllers, so they've replaced them. They've still probably got a couple on for the harder clients, but they've obviously figured out that they don't need relationships or credit controllers who have strong relationships. Instead, they're neutralizing it with an AI person. So interesting to see how that goes. I do know there's another client of mine who now they in their board pack and their management reports, they've got an image of themselves and then they've put that into a video and then all the text in the report, that's gone into a script. And so they've now created this person, well, for themselves to do a video to bring the numbers to life. Now, I think it's quite smart. I'm not sure how they go answering questions, but again, someone's been quite creative about how they're managing to do it. And, I do know a fair few people who are using AI to manipulate large volumes of data. So accountants, are trying to build tools to extract data and they're doing it a lot quicker. So that's definitely a time saving impact, which is having maybe a positive impact on time. And the last one is, I read this morning, it's called the AI boss effect. Now, there's a survey by an organization called Resume Now, and 97% of employees ask ChatGPT for advice instead of their boss. That's 97%. And out of those, 63% do it pretty regularly. Also, the survey went on to say that 70% say that ChatGPT understands their work challenges much better than their manager does. Now, again, ChatGPT is in the same room as them. If you're working remotely, that's a challenge, right? But the other quite daunting fact is that 93% use it to prepare for a conversation with their manager. So bear that in mind when you're doing your staff reviews, because it is having an impact. Obviously, the big thing to remember is that, AI cannot replicate professional judgment yet. It will definitely have an impact. It's here to stay. It's being utilized already. But in my mind, it seems that some people are using it in a more of a beneficial manner. So to summarize, what we've learned today is we know that in Sydney, employment opportunities are really pretty good. There's a lot out there. We know that salaries are up 4.9%, and that's not too bad. We know the job ad volume in New South Wales is pretty healthy. We know that working from home, we know accountants love working in a hybrid working arrangement. And when you're hiring, if you want to hire the best type of people, you really want to hire against competencies in a pretty smooth, seamless process. I've given you some good examples of how AI is being utilized. And obviously, that's important to understand how you can get the best use out of your organization without spending a small fortune. We know the future opportunities lie in, ESG, cyber tech, and of course, AI. And for you to, stay relevant as a finance leader, you need to develop your leadership skills and you also need to develop your communication skills. If you wish to find out any further information, please go to our website or get in touch with one of our consultants after you've watched this. We'd love to help you out and we look forward to hearing from you.